No excuses. Nowhere to hide. As the International Criminal Court's prosecutor applies for arrest warrants over Israel-Palestine, it won't just be those named in his statement who will be feeling distinctly rattled right now. You see, it was clear from the very beginning that a crime of historic proportions was being committed. Israel's leaders made it abundantly clear from the very beginning that they were going to commit terrible atrocities involving mass slaughter and mass destruction. Not once, not twice, not three times, but over and over and over and over again. Those who facilitated and legitimised this atrocity will, if they've got any sense, now be in a state of panic because they're going to be held to account by us. And we're not going to give up seeking holding them to account for the rest of their lives. Now, let's just familiarise ourselves with what's happened here. Karim Khan KC, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has applied for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as three Hamas leaders. Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, Mohammed Diab Ibrahim al-Mazri, the Commander-in-Chief of the Al-Qassam Brigades, or Hamas's military wing, and Ismail Haniyeh, the head of the Hamas Political Bureau. Now, let's just deal with the arrest warrants for Hamas's leaders first. Now, some of us had moral consistency from the start. On the 10th of October, I went on Sky News along with the Labour MP, pro-Israel Labour MP, Margaret Hodge, and said,
"There's no cause on earth which justifies the slaughter of innocent civilians."
This should be a basic building block, you see, of moral clarity, of moral consistency. I believe the generations-old war against the Palestinian people to be a grave crime, or rather a litany of grave crimes. The murderous ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, the repeated ethnic cleansing since, the longest belligerent occupation of modern times, the theft of Palestinian land and its colonisation with illegal settlements, the apartheid, the repeated bouts of mass murder, the mass incarcerations without trial for those who should be regarded as Palestinian hostages, the torture, including the physical and sexual abuse of children detained by the Israeli state. We could go on. This, nor anything else, does not justify war crimes and the intentional targeting of civilians. I've spent more time than I would like watching harrowing evidence of atrocities committed against Israeli civilians on the 7th of October. That includes the taking of hostages. These were war crimes and justice should prevail. The prosecutor declares he has reasonable grounds to believe that Hamas leaders have criminal responsibility for a range of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including extermination, murder and hostage taking, and the evidence for war crimes and crimes against humanity is overwhelming. The point is that the crimes committed by the Israeli state are firstly those of a long-standing occupier waging a generations-long war against an occupied and subjugated people. Secondly, because of this, and because indeed it is a military superpower, its crimes are much graver and deadlier and far more destructive. And thirdly, its crimes are directly facilitated by Western governments through weapons and diplomatic and political support and aid, as well as legitimised by our media outlets. This should answer the desperate cries you will hear of whataboutery. So when the Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid publicly declares the ICC arrest warrants are a complete moral failure, we cannot accept the outrageous comparison between Netanyahu and Sinwar, between the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Hamas. Well, maybe he's got a point in the sense that Israel's crimes are much worse. Then he's right. That isn't to deny Israel has committed serious crimes, as I've detailed, which of course it has and for which it must face justice for. Let's just detail the proposed charges against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yoav Gallant for criminal responsibility for these war crimes and crimes against humanity. Starvation of civilians as a method of warfare as a war crime. Willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health and cruel treatment as a war crime. Willful killing and murder as a war crime. Intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as a war crime. Extermination and murder, including in the context of deaths caused by starvation, as a crime against humanity. Persecution as a crime against humanity. Other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity. He adds, the prosecutor, that his office submit that the crimes against humanity charged were committed as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the Palestinian civilian population pursuant to state policy. These crimes, in our assessment, he says, continue to this day, as indeed they do. They refer his office to evidence collected, including interviews with survivors and eyewitnesses, authenticated video, photo and audio material, satellite imagery and statement from the alleged perpetrator group shows that Israel has intentionally and systematically deprived the civilian population in all parts of Gaza of objects indispensable to human survival. The prosecutor refers to the imposition of a total siege on Gaza, including closing 3 border crossing points from 8th of October for an extended period, and then by arbitrarily restricting the transfer of essential supplies, not least food and medicine, when crossings were reopened. That siege, he notes, included cutting off water pipelines and electricity supplies. It included attacks on civilians, such as those queuing for food, obstructing aid delivery by humanitarian agencies, attacks on and killing of aid workers, forcing many agencies to cease or limit operations in Gaza. A crucial point he makes here. My office admits that these acts were committed as part of a common plan to use starvation as a method of war and other acts of violence against the Gazan civilian population as a means to 1, eliminate Hamas, 2, secure the return of the hostages which Hamas has abducted, and 3, collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza, whom they perceived as a threat to Israel. It's worth absorbing that point. He holds that the state of Israel decided that the civilian population as a whole were a threat to Israel. That being, of course, collective punishment, thereby making them a target for starvation and extermination. After detailing the consequences, famine, with the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded anywhere, anytime, as a result of an entirely man-made disaster, he declares, notwithstanding any military goals they have, the means Israel chose to achieve them in Gaza, namely intentionally causing death, starvation, great suffering, and serious injury to body or health of the civilian population, are criminal. What he seeks to do here is nullify the claims of self-defence. There is no legal defence for the crimes committed, whatever the circumstances, in other words. Now, there are important omissions here. While Hamas leaders stand accused of criminal responsibility for torture, Israel does not, despite overwhelming evidence, including Palestinian detainees being tortured to death. Neither have charges of genocide been offered. But notably, in his statement, he notes his office is examining reports in relationship to the large-scale bombing that has caused and continues to cause so many civilian deaths, injuries in Gaza. And he said these should be... So therefore, we should look at this as potentially initially proposed charges with other charges to come. Now, let's just listen to what he says here.
Today, we underline in the clearest possible fashion that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to everyone. No foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. Nothing on earth can justify willfully depriving human beings, including women and children, babies, the old and the young, of the basic necessities required for life. Nothing on earth can justify hostage taking or the targeting and killing of civilians.
Well, Israel has enjoyed impunity for a very long time, and that impunity is now disintegrating in real time. The biggest hammer blow to Israel's impunity has been delivered since its foundation over 3/4 of a century ago. Let's listen to the final statement of his.
Today, I wish to underline one message very clearly. It's my strong conviction that if we do not demonstrate our willingness to apply the law equally, if it is seen as being applied selectively, we will be creating the conditions for its complete collapse. And in doing so, we would be loosening the remaining bonds that hold us together, the stabilizing connections between all communities, all individuals, the safety net to which all victims look to in times of suffering. This is the true risk we face at this perilous moment. Now more than ever, we must collectively demonstrate that international humanitarian law, the foundational baseline for human conduct during conflict, applies to all individuals and applies equally across situations addressed by my office and by the court. This is how we will prove, tangibly, in real terms, for all victims, that the lives of all human beings, wherever they may be, have equal value.
Well, here's a crucial point. There's been no pretense since this horror began that Palestinian life has anything like equal value. Palestinian life has been treated as having almost no value. There hasn't even been a pretense. It's been open, blatant, and brazen by politicians and media outlets. Now I want to discuss the responsibility of those who facilitated and legitimised this crime of historic proportions. But first, what happens next? This is for now an application for arrest warrants, but note it has the backing of a prestigious panel of experts in international law, including, it should be noted, Amal Clooney, who has been aggressively denounced for her silence over the last few months. Well, now we know why. She wasn't able to comment because of her participation in this process. Now, the arrest warrants have to be approved by the pre-trial chamber. In the case of Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's former military dictator, the ICC request for an arrest warrant was issued in July 2008, but only approved in March 2009. In the case of Vladimir Putin, the request was made in February 2023 and approved the following month. So far, one public application for an arrest warrant has been denied, but it was issued on subsequent application, while one charge in the al-Bashir case was issued only after an appeal. Now, the British government has come out and said the ICC don't have jurisdiction over Israel. That's a lie and it knows it. Joe Biden, president who will go down in history as genocide, Joe, meanwhile, has declared the ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. Now, like Russia, Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. Ukraine isn't a signatory to the ICC either, but it offered the ICC jurisdiction over its territory. Accordingly, when the ICC applied for an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden welcomed it. What's even more embarrassing is the UK Foreign Minister, Andrew Mitchell, declared the ICC today doesn't have jurisdiction because back in November he declared it's not for ministers to seek to state where the ICC has jurisdiction. That's for the chief prosecutor. He also said then it's not for me to fetter or speak in the place of its chief prosecutor. Hoisted petard. Now, what this means in practice is that if the warrants are served, ICC states are legally obliged to arrest those named if they land on their soil. Some of you may conclude that may never happen. Well, maybe not. This is a catastrophe, let's be clear, for the Israeli state. A catastrophe. The world order, the world legal order, is rigged in favour of the West, the global North. And the global North, the West, principally the US and its allies, have used that fact to offer Israel impunity. Now, the Times of Israel reported that when Karen Khan was elected chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, he was actually Israel's preferred candidate. He is the brother of a British Conservative MP. But let's be clear about the significance of all of this. And let's focus on those who facilitated and legitimised this great crime. There are no excuses. There is nowhere to hide. From the very beginning, it was clear that a crime of historic proportions was going to be committed by the state of Israel. Back in October, I wrote a Guardian column, and it was headlined, "Israel is clear about its intentions in Gaza. World leaders cannot plead ignorance of what is coming." I wrote that column for a reason. It was obvious that a crime on an unimaginable scale was being committed, and that as the brutal reality became widely accepted and undeniable, those who legitimised and cheered on this abomination would plead ignorance and indeed offer regret. I wrote this article as a marker to clarify that it was abundantly clear at the time what the Israeli state was unleashing and that there was no excuse for not knowing what they were doing. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. From the very start, statements of murderous intent making it clear that Israel was committed to mass indiscriminate slaughter and destruction were made by government ministers in Israel, by politicians, by generals, by army officers, by soldiers, by journalists, by entire media outlets, by public figures. We could go on in an orgy of genocidal mania. There are enough of these statements to fill an entire book or indeed several volumes, but suffice it to say that rarely in history has a state so openly declared over and over and over again in the most grotesque, depraved and inhuman language that it intended to commit terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity as it did them, often in overtly genocidal terms. Such statements led the Israeli-American Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Raz Sigal, who I interviewed myself, to declare just 9 days after 7th of October, "We're seeing the combination of genocidal acts with special intent. This is indeed a textbook case of genocide. No excuses, nowhere to hide." When Yoav Gallant declared a complete siege with no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel on the grounds, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly, why was his word not taken literally? Do people think that was just hyperbole? Maybe they thought he was having a joke. Did our politicians and commentators believe that when Gallant ordered his officers or told them that he had lifted all restrictions and separately all restraints on them, that he wasn't to be taken literally? Really? No excuses. Nowhere to hide. Listen, for example, to Major General Ghassan Alian, charged with Israel's military occupations and its operations in the occupied territories, declaring on the 9th of October, Hamas became ISIS, and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza. No electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell. You will get hell. I ask you, what room is there for subtlety? And I'll tell you, there is none. No excuses, nowhere to hide. Those who legitimised and facilitated and cheered this horror on knew from the start that a military superpower was carpet bombing a tiny strip of land no bigger than East London, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, with explosives equivalent to several Hiroshima bombs. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that most civilian infrastructure was being severely damaged and destroyed. Homes, schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, ancient landmarks. So much so that Gaza now looks a different colour and texture when looked at from space. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that tens of thousands of Palestinians were being buried alive under the rubble of their own homes, some killed immediately, others, including thousands of children, slowly cooked alive, slowly suffocated alive, or slowly cooked and suffocated alive, sometimes spending hours suffering the most agonising deaths imaginable while listening to the screams of their dying loved ones. No excuses, nowhere to hide. The complicit knew that Israel was overseeing the biggest slaughter of aid workers and journalists ever recorded in such a short space of time in any conflict in human history. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that the medical system was being systematically destroyed by the Israeli state, its hospitals razed to the ground, its doctors and nurses and patients slaughtered so that maimed babies had their limbs amputated without anaesthetic, so that pregnant women had their newborns delivered by caesarean without anaesthetic. No excuses, nowhere to hide. And as the ICC statement makes clear, the complicit knew Israel had deliberately and systematically blocked the very basic means of survival: food, water, energy, medicine, imposing mass death on a civilian population, resulting in the biggest drop in the nutritional status of a population ever recorded. No excuses, nowhere to hide. We all had front row seats to some of the worst crimes committed in the 21st century as they were live streamed on a daily basis. The first live streamed genocide in history, as it was called, for a reason. Few horrors in history have so much overwhelming documented evidence. And all that time, throughout, the Israeli state repeatedly promised an atrocity of biblical proportions, which I say literally, because in the case of Netanyahu, he invokes the story of Amalek, in which God orders the Israelites to kill men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys, and my word, did they deliver to the letter. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. President Joe Biden promised ironclad support for Israel and offered a limitless supply of weapons, including 2,000-pound dumb bombs, which were repeatedly used to rip apart the bodies of innocent civilians, including so many children, not least in areas designated safe zones. No excuses, nowhere to hide. Our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in Britain was aware that Israel's leaders had promised this horrific bloodbath when he declared the state had an absolute right to defend itself, and we see that absolute right, as he defined it, played out on a daily basis ever since, while his Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, promised to keep selling Israel weapons no matter what, even though it was clear his own lawyers had told him that Israel was breaking international law. No excuses, nowhere to hide. And don't forget Keir Starmer. Don't forget him, the leader of the opposition, who at the very beginning declared Israel had the right to cut off water and energy, despite his later disgusting attempts to gaslight us into believing he had never supported this abominable war crime. One specifically condemned by the prosecutor, as he noted how water pipelines and electricity supplies were cut off in his statement. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. And as for our media, our brave, courageous media. Now, there were examples of brilliant reporting, and we should be very grateful for that. Although, should we? Because this was the bare minimum. But it was there. But overall, this is one of the greatest journalistic scandals in history, and my word, the bar for that. Why was coverage of Israel's murderous onslaught not framed around the public statements of Israel's leaders? Not only did this not happen, even when they explicitly made clear their motives over and over again, many of these blood-curdling promises were barely even mentioned in Western coverage, despite proving the best and most accurate roadmap to the entirely predictable horrors which unfolded. Entire crimes were ignored and whitewashed. The lies of Israeli leaders were deferred to. They were allowed to muddy the waters. Palestinian voices were marginalised and ignored and defamed over and over and over again. The famine, which we're now discussing, how much coverage was there of the intentional attempt by the Israeli state to manufacture that famine? No excuses and nowhere to hide. It is clear what happened here. Those who are responsible for legitimising and facilitating this grotesque crime, which will be remembered throughout the ages, they thought they'd get away with it because Palestinian life has been devalued to the point of having no value at all. Here, my friends, is a depraved story of where dehumanisation at its most flagrant leaves us. Here too is a legacy of our failure to hold to account those responsible for previous catastrophes, not least those who drowned Iraq in blood and chaos, who walk from crime scene to crime scene splattered with more blood and get away with it. They believed, understandably, those therefore who cheered this atrocity on, that they can get away with anything. And they clearly saw Israel's own impunity as a form of collective insurance which would protect them as well. Well, we cannot let them get away with it. Our politicians and media outlets made this possible. They gave Israel the weapons and the cover to commit some of the worst crimes of our age. We can't let them get away with it. This isn't vengeance. There's not some satisfaction of winning an argument. But because unless we hold them to account for what they've done, then the horrors we have seen are the foreshadow of much worse to come. By denouncing the International Criminal Court's request for these arrest warrants, Western states have made it clear that they are determined to bury any semblance of an international order in which basic human rights and justice is upheld, even though we know how that order works in practice. But the consequences of burying it so overtly will prove catastrophic. We can't let them get away with it. So many lives depend on it. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. Please like and subscribe. We've got lots of coverage to come on this, including interviews with people who need to be heard. And we won't stop holding to account the politicians and media outlets who made this abominable crime possible. Do leave your comments. Do share the video. Keep the show on the road and help us take on the pro-war media at patreon.com/OJ84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.